Hi, welcome to First Congregational Church's online service. My name is Dr. Tom, pastor of this church, and we are in the midst of a series called Recalculating. Now, I'm sure you've been on some kind of a road trip that used GPS. Like, is there another way to travel? I don't think so. How do we even get around before GPS? And then when you take a wrong turn, like the GPS unit automatically recalculates a track to get you back on your way. Now, oftentimes in life, we get sidetracked from the way that Jesus taught us to live, a life of self-sacrificial love, and we get all tangled up in side roads of selfishness and indifference or ignorance of the world's sufferings. But to love is to believe that another person's reality is just as real as your own, like their perspectives, their sufferings, their understandings, their responsibilities, the pressures that they live within and under, right? When you can see that their reality is just as felt as your own, you begin to love. And when you get that understanding, what is brought out of you is called empathy. And to act according to empathy then is called kindness. And oftentimes we need to recalculate our path when we stray from there to get back on track. Now, this series from the Gospel of Luke, it continues with Jesus' Passover pilgrimage on the road to Jerusalem in preparation for the crucifixion. Now, the people pilgriming start to accompany Jesus' traveling band and believe Jesus to be the Messiah, and he multiplies thousands of followers here. Now, the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the day, were not happy with the popularity of Jesus and his following, especially since they were heading to Roman-occupied Jerusalem. They feared this violent uprising that will bring Rome's army crashing down upon their heads. So much of their criticism flows from this fear, and it causes them to try and dance with the political powers of the world and the religious powers of the world, and they just get themselves in a lot of trouble. Now, today's message is going to be a little bit different than normal because scholars actually don't agree on the actual points of this parable. They don't agree on some of the cultural applications of the passage. They don't even agree on its overall message and its meaning. So today I kind of wander around this parable with some reflective points and some cultural insights, some of Luke's narrative context. And we don't have to figure it all out. We can let today's passage read us and interpret us and recalculate our navigation route in life. So today, Jesus turns to his disciples and specifically teaches them something which recalculates their expectations of what God is actively doing in the world. And he does this by telling them a parable. And this parable is really confusing. So let's dive in with an overview of what this passage says, and then we'll meander around some reflections on the other side. All right, so confession, as a pastor, I do a good amount of funerals. And in some funerals, there's this procession to the resting place, i.e. the cemetery with all the cars going with the flags on it, right? And there you have a graveside service. And then the officiant pastor usually drives in the passenger seat of the coach car, which used to be called the hearse, but it's now called the coach, which I didn't know that until very recently. Okay, so the funeral director or worker who drives the coach, he always opens the door for the officiating pastor, which is really weird because he opens the door for me and then I have to get in, and then he closes the door on the other side of me after I'm seated. And it's so weird because it makes me feel like I'm confused for royalty or a celebrity or something. Like, hey, I can open my own door. Thank you. You don't have to do that. You're not like my butler or something. And it makes me feel weird. But today's parable told by Jesus is actually about a butler, kind of. That's the closest modern day equivalent that I could think of. So a butler is like this high-ranking servant in a wealthy household who runs the administration of the house, right? Like the finances, the paperwork, the servant staff, the repairs, everything to keep the house moving. Think of like Mr. Carson from Downton Abbey. Fantastic show. Now, the text in here refers to this guy, not as the butler, but as the manager. Okay? So when you hear the manager, think Mr. Carson, butler. All right, now the story goes this way. Once there was a man of great wealth who had a manager. Then there came some accusations that the manager had actually embezzled the resources of the estate. So the wealthy man summoned the manager and said, "What's with these accusations I've heard? Show me the books, because you're fired." So the manager says to himself, like, all right, what am I going to do now that I'm fired? I'm not strong enough to dig ditches and holes and wells, and I'm too proud to beg. So then he gets this idea. He's like, I know what I'm going to do, he says to himself, so that after I'm fired, I'll be welcomed into homes. So what he does is he summons each of his master's debtors, saying, what do you owe? And one guy says 100 measures of oil. Okay, write it down as 50. Another guy says, well, 100 measures of wheat. Okay, write that down for 80. And then it says the master approved of the injustice of the manager because it showed shrewd wisdom. Okay, that's a weird story if you ask me. What does it all mean? Like Jesus' explanation that follows is just as cryptic and confusing. He said, well, the sons of this age are more shrewd than the sons of light. So make friends like this, so when things fall apart, you have eternal dwellings. Because those who are faithful with little are faithful with much, and those who are unjust in little will be unjust in much. If you're not faithful with unjust wealth, who will trust you with true wealth? And if you're not faithful with other people's stuff, who will give you your own stuff? Because you can't serve two masters of God and money. Got it? Clear as mud, right? This one's totally stumped me, and I had read so many academic articles, old medieval new commentaries, like church fathers and mothers, mystics, language studies, cultural studies, ancient historians of the day, like that were both Greek and Roman and Hebrew. I read everything I could find on this passage, and I didn't know, and nobody agreed. So what do we even do with this passage like this, where everyone's arguing about what it means? Well, we'll break it up, check each section out a little bit at a time, and we're not going to get all the meaning out of this passage, and that's totally fine. But at the end, hopefully we get some kind of clarity on what this could mean for us today. So let's dive into this passage and just see what we see. Hey, it's fall this coming week, officially, like the autumn equinox is upon us. I'm out here at sunset, and it's gonna set in almost the exact west over there. That's what happens in the equinox. The sun is equally on the earth. And I'm mourning the passing of summer once again, and I'm dreading the coming of winter. But there's one thing that us Michiganders like to do in the fall, and that is go to an apple orchard and pick apples and drink cider and eat donuts and find pumpkins. That's one thing we look forward to, along with the beauty of the leaves, right? Now, I say this because it's the only experience I really have with an agricultural dry measurement called the bushel. Now, at home, I measure dry things with cups and spoons, right? 3 tablespoons, 2 cups, quarter cup, right? But in large quantities, that's just totally insufficient. You can't get through 3 million tablespoons of apple. So at an orchard, you don't get to pick a gallon of apples, right? But a half bushel or a peck, depending on how many pies you're going to make. So in today's passage, we have some measurements that are foreign to many of our ears because, well, one, I don't use agricultural ones very often, but 2, I don't use these ones at all. So how much oil and wheat are we talking about? Since the guy was like, how much oil you got, how much wheat you owe, right? Now, the English word translated for both measures of oil and wheat is translated into measures. 100 measures of this and 100 measures of that. But the Greek word for both of these are totally different from one another. The oil is said to be 100 baths. Yeah, like bathtub. And wheat is said to be 100 kor, K-O-R. And these terms are agricultural measurements of the day, much like we have gallons for liquid and bushels for dry. So how much is a bath and a kor? That was in my brain, that was my question, because it's really helpful for me to visualize the amounts we're talking about here so we know exactly what's getting forgiven and what the guys are going to owe. So a bath is a liquid measurement that is about 9 gallons. So you can imagine 2 5-gallon buckets nearly full. That's one bath. So 100 baths of oil, like that one guy owed, ends up being about 900 gallons of oil. Okay, that's a lot of oil. You can fill up 6 hot tubs with olive oil if you want to deep fry the biggest turkey known to man, probably. It might not be able to get it hot enough with the tub. Okay, next is a kor. It's a dry measurement that ends up being 11 bushels, which I didn't really know what a bushel looked like. So a bushel is roughly 10 gallons a bucket. So 1 core is 11 bushels. So a single core ends up being like 100 gallons. So just imagine this guy had 100 core of wheat. So that's going to be about 10,000 gallons of grain. Okay, I know that's a liquid measurement, but think roughly the size of a tanker truck filled with grain all the way inside. Oh, that's a lot. Who needs to borrow a tanker truck full of wheat? I don't know, but that's a lot of wheat. Now, these are either going to be commercial loans, though probably not, or tenant farmers renting the master's land to cultivate crops. And this would be a share that was owed back to the landowner, but with interest. Okay, now we're getting into banking. We went from agriculture to banking here. The interest rate on oil back in the day was 100%. You borrow 50, you owe 100. Right? The interest rates on wheat was about 50%, right? So you borrow 40, you got to pay back 60. Now, before you lose your mind thinking about how crazy that interest rate is, when we have mortgage rates of 6.9%, which we also think is insane, just think about the translation of that 6.9% to the overall end goal. If you bought a house for $250K and you put the 20% down of $50K, after your 30-year mortgage at 7% interest, you will actually pay $530,000 for a $250,000 house, which that ends up being an interest rate in these terms of 212% at the end of a 30-year cycle. Whoa, that's a lot. So this man probably, when he brought these people in and asked, how much do you owe, let's cancel this, he's actually just canceling the interest on the loans that he had, and then they just merely had to pay back the original amount borrowed with no interest, which is the thing that the Old Testament law would require, because it says, do not charge interest on loans. Leviticus says, direct quote, if your brother becomes poor, and brother meaning someone who is your kin, not just family. If your brother becomes poor and he cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, which means you're going to take good care of him if he's a stranger and a sojourner. And he shall live with you, take no interest from him or profit, but instead fear your God that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. Okay, so the manager here canceling the interest has done two things. First, he has earned some friendship among those whom he probably extorted in the past, and he didn't have really good terms with them, and now he's got a place to crash after he's fired, a place to go. He's got friends. And second, he made his master look generous because, oh wow, look at this guy. He canceled the interest on these loans. What a nice guy he is. So now the master can't give punishment for this guy's actions. Holy cow, this guy is very shrewd and very wise indeed. That was very smart of him. But the question remains, what does this have to do with Jesus? And anything for that matter. It's a cool story. Let's find out. All right, so the direct answer to what does this have to do with Jesus is, I don't know. I'm not sure. But we're going to do a little bit of meandering and find something out. Now, in modern day, we live in a capitalist society. Now, I'm not an economist, but I do know that the capitalism concept started when our place in the world was much smaller than it is now. So forests, prairies, oceans, lakes, metals, ores, mountains, they all seemed unlimited. So an underpinning understanding of modern day capitalism that comes from this is that if you are poor, it's the only excuse you have is laziness, because anybody can go out there and get whatever they want from the unlimited resources at our fingertips. Your fault. Now, this is not totally true because we now know that these resources are not unlimited. Naturalist David Attenborough, one of my heroes, recounts his life in a recent documentary on Netflix that said in 1937, when Attenborough was 11 years old, only 2.3 billion people lived on the planet, and 66% of the world's wilderness remained. Today, however, the world's population has more than tripled. Wilderness has shrunk to a paltry 35%, and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has shot through the roof. Okay, so these resources are not unlimited. We're down to 35% of wilderness left on our planet. That's a very big shrink in one lifetime. So the folks in our story, they lived long before David Attenborough, but they believed that the resources of the good life were finite and usually confiscated by people like the wealthy landowner in this story. Now, the majority of the people would believe that the wealthy man unjustly racked up riches at the expense of those around him, because there's only one way to get rich in this society, and that's to take from those around you. And that's what he did, charging interest rates that they couldn't repay. And then when they couldn't repay it, he would acquire them as people to be his servants and slaves, and then he would acquire their property as repayment for the things that were owed to him. So the manager was probably acquired in the same manner, but worked his way up in the ranks to become this manager of the household. Now, he was along for the ride and trying to squeeze every penny here and there for his own security, because this is how the game works. Survival of the ruthless. But survival of the ruthless makes a ruthless society. And 95% of the population in this day lived in poverty and were oftentimes kept there by the usury and extortion of those who held all of the land, like wealthy landowners in this story. Now, this manager somehow weaseled his way to the top of the bottom class of society. But now he's being dismissed based on accusations which were never investigated. Now, a dismissal would be worse than being sold as a servant to somebody else, because being dismissed means he has no home, he has no land, he has no means to care for himself, and probably no friends in the community, since he may have extorted his neighbors to get a few pennies. So he says he's too old for manual labor, and he's too proud from living this status of life to now start begging for his food. So his plan was to forgive the interest rates on these loans. And it's genius because it opens up homes and communities. What do you do with money that you unjustly accumulated? Well, you forgive the debts. You stop playing the game. As Jesus says, you sin against the system of money. That's the direct Greek here, is that he's sinning against the system of money making. So the term wealth, used in this final line, when he says you can't serve God and wealth, it's actually used 3 times in Luke, and it's all in this one story. You can't serve both God and wealth. Now, the manager literally served wealth, literally, because the wealthy man is a personification of it. The same Greek word used to describe him. And it asks this manager to cheat his neighbors, so he did. And it asked him to feed the machine of wealth and squabble for some pennies, and he did, and it cost him his standing in the community. So, what does he do? He sins against the wealth through the act of debt forgiveness, and earns favor with the community, and saves his own skin in the process. Now, Jesus is talking to the disciples specifically with this passage, giving them instructions on how to move forward without him after the crucifixion. And if you remember, he's already taught them a prayer. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those indebted to us. And this manager is an embodiment of that prayer, because he sins against his neighbors and he forgives their debts. Now, he's saying, don't be blind like these Pharisaical sons of light here, who are trying to dance with the powers of the world. Instead, be wise. Sin against the system of violence. Sin against the system of extortion with radical forgiveness. Because when that system turns on you to devour you, forgiveness will have prepared a home for you to land. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us in our digital space, even though this doesn't look very digital. It was all beautiful outdoor sunset stuff. But thanks for joining us. We hope that you found some hope, help, and healing in some form or fashion today. You got a little bit of an understanding of this passage and how it can fit into your life. If you found the spirit of this teaching helpful, you can belong with us, a part of our community here online or in person if you're in Langsburg. All you got to do is follow us on Facebook or Instagram. and you get to see all the releases of these things. You can subscribe on YouTube and see a little early release of this on Friday, and that'd be cool too. You can be a part of us that way, or you can show up on a Sunday. We won't kick you out, I promise. We're fun and we don't bite. So you can show up there. If you want to partner with us financially and you found this helpful, you want to bless us, down at your bottom of your screen right down here, there is a website you can type in, do a one-time or recurring giving, and any level of support would be a blessing to us as we seek the hope, help, and healing in our community and out in the internet lands. And if you want to follow us next week, we got another one of these coming. Final one for recalculating. Keep getting those mixed up in my head. But recalculating part 4, I think, or 3. It's part 3 next week, and it'll be our final one. And then we start an October series. It'll be fun. So peace out, and we'll see you next week.
Well, hey, welcome to First Congregational Church's online service.
All right, testing 1, 2, 3, 4 from this angle. Well, hey, welcome to First Congregation Church's First Congregational. We start a new series this week. No, we don't. Take lost count. There's been so many. 100 gallons, because 11 bushels is a 10-gallon bucket, and a 10-gallon bucket is 100 gallons. What the heck? God, made it. Jeez. Well, I thank you, little bit.